Consciousness as reality. We're going to discuss the Kybalion's perspective on fluidity of mind and combine it with what I learned way back in the days, but really started to understand deeper as I went further along this journey. Consciousness as reality. Now, an interesting reflection is I read the Master Key System back in 2008, and I thought it was a very profound text. However, recently, when I reviewed it again, I realized that there was more information in there than I experienced before because of my altered perception. Now, altered perception refers to alignment with what I call higher self, or your true being, which is a journey. As a result of the alteration of your consciousness through the journey, both conscious and subconscious, that makes up your identity, the self-image, we begin to interpret reality from a different perspective. This includes information. And even though this information existed back then in the actual text, the text appeared differently because my consciousness has been altered. Now, when I'm referring again to altered consciousness, I'm really referring to being more in alignment with a higher self-based consciousness, to then understand reality from a perspective of what I call accurate thinking, reflected as experiences and interpretation of people, environment, circumstance, and information that is seen as contributing to who you are and what you desire to create. That affirmation expresses itself through the impression on the subconscious mind as reality to reflect. Now, we're going to discuss this from three important perspectives. Quotes from Charles Haanel's book, The Master Key System, which I'll probably be discussing upcoming, as well as reflection on the Kybalion's principle of polarity. Number one, the all as externalization of consciousness. In the Kybalion, it states, the all is mind, the universe is mental. Neville Goddard says, everyone is you pushed out. I believe that reality is an externalization of consciousness. Everyone's saying the same thing, just communicating it using different words. And while there may be some nuanced perspectives on this particular universal idea, we have to remember what Charles Haanel says in the Master Key System to bring it all together. There is only one consciousness in the universe. That it is able to think necessarily follows that your consciousness is identical with the universal consciousness. Or, in other words, all mind is one mind. There is no dodging this conclusion. Now, reflecting on my journey, in the earlier stages, I saw myself separate from people, environment, circumstance, and information. I said outer world and inner world. As I continue to evolve my understanding of myself and my consciousness and its externalization in reality, I see more of the accurate oneness, as in altering my consciousness, evolving it or changing it, externalizes as experience different information being presented a certain way, or what we would call results or manifestation. And this is a journey. So in different stages, we could be in varying degrees in affirmation of this, or in denial of this, or anywhere in the spectrum on various topics, on various information, on various relationships, and so forth. To ease the mind, because the goal is really to build a heart-mind relationship, in other words, the heart desires and the mind creates via the imagination, we understand the law of polarity, realizing that there is no extreme hot and no extreme cold, but there is infinite varying degrees within. Just as, for example, when you are creating something, there's infinite ways to look at what you're creating, and there are infinite ways to look at how you're going to create it. In other words, the way it will be brought forth can be a result of infinite potentiality, And this infinite potentiality is affirmed further by realizing that you are actually one mind with everything. So thus, by seeing yourself connected with everything and one with everything, you then have a greater degree of what I would call conceptual influence. In other words, you always had the influence, except now the concept, the idea that there is only one consciousness, brings you further into alignment with the possibility of creating reality, because you don't see things as separate. What you do see things as, or people, or information as, is related to the consciousness within. In other words, all people represent a mood within us. All reality represents a mood within us, an interpretation within us, a perspective within us. The consciousness that focuses in your brain cells is the same consciousness which focuses in the brain cells of every other individual. Okay, the same consciousness, the one consciousness, exists and focuses our brain cells in the same way as it does with every other individual. Now, this way of thinking is, for many, an altered state of consciousness. In other words, if we believe we're separate, then we interpret reality, we navigate reality, and we create reality from that perspective, which may or may not be empowering or disempowering. But when we see ourselves to a higher degree of connectivity, as in it is all one externalized, then we have a greater ability of understanding how everything is related, because we're able to look and see things for what they really are, which is a representation of what is within our consciousness. There is but one consciousness in the universe, able to think, and when it thinks, its thoughts become objective things to it. Thoughts are things. Reality is an externalization of what is within our consciousness, most of it being within the subconscious awareness. In other words, we don't know how we're going to create it, but we allow the powers of the subconscious mind to create accordingly, and it has always been that way, except now we're becoming more conscious of this understanding of what is within our subconscious and adjusting it to create reality accordingly. And one of the affirmations we want on our subconscious is that universal consciousness and individual consciousness are one, and that there is no dodging this conclusion. The very affirmation enables, or we could say unlocks, or expresses the divine will to create reality accordingly through the belief. So again, there is but one consciousness in the universe able to think, and when it thinks, its thoughts become objective things to it. In other words, everyone is thinking the same thing from different perspectives. Everyone is doing the same thing from different perspectives, and all are in harmony with the idea that you want to see brought forth. To believe it's possible can be experienced at a certain stage of consciousness as an extremely radically altered state of consciousness, and thus impossible. However, we have to remember that there are infinite states of consciousness, and all is possible, and we are on the journey to realizing higher degrees of possibility. So it's okay if in certain environments it does not externalize the way you desire. There appears to be resistance based on the idea. We have not in that moment been able to understand or alter the mind or the consciousness to reflect the change within in the outer world that we consciously desire. And at that moment, that environment presents to us opportunity, which I call the cause within reflective consciousness. So as mentioned, there's different states of consciousness, infinity states of consciousness, and we put labels on them. So we can say things like abundance consciousness, scarcity consciousness, fear consciousness, or very specific states of consciousness in imagination that express itself in reality. Specific states, exact, identical, imaginary scenes, as Neville Goddard puts it, externalized as the outcome in reality. So, one state of mind that can be very helpful for us to navigate reality, experience reality, and express reality from a conscious and subconscious alignment to realize the externalization of it with precision is every now and then going into what I call the cause within, reflective consciousness. In other words, what you're really looking to do is look at the outer world and identify the different experiences and the interpretation of the five sensory data, which represent people, environment, circumstance, and information, to interpret it from the perspective of what am I identifying within to experience the outer world and these elements accordingly. The I am consciousness, we can say that as well, as in, what are we saying I am to? If we have an experience that we call undesirable, what are we identifying with in that experience that we are saying I am to? For example, say you are walking down the street. And while you're walking down the street, you see somebody look at you a certain way. And the way they look at you makes you feel disempowered. You feel what you call insecure. In that moment, you can write that down and reflect later, or reflect in the moment and say, what am I identifying with right now in my consciousness that is externalizing as this experience that I call feeling less self-esteem or low self-esteem? And it is not necessarily what the intent is by the other person. And when we look at it from the perspective of consciousness is externalized as reality, then our perspective is the true perspective. So you say, by this look, it makes me feel insecure. What if I evolve my perspective to say, if I get that look, I feel more confident? So based on the cause within reflective consciousness, we're able to identify what is the cause within, as in, what are we saying I am to? And the I am to is presented in a way where someone looks at you a certain way and you say, I am insecure, subconsciously or consciously now, because you're making the subconscious conscious, that you're assuming that what it means is that by them looking at you that way, you evoke what you call a low self-esteem consciousness. However, after having this inner dialogue, you realize that you can choose a different meaning to the way they look at you. You can actually see it as empowering, uplifting. And if it appears difficult to do so, then understand this is probably because we have not received programming from the outer world. In other words, no one has taught us to interpret that look that they give to us in a way of empowerment. However, we remember that the subconscious mind is either impressed by information or interpretation or perspective, in other words, suggestion from the outer world, or suggestion from the inner world via imagination, and creates reality accordingly. So from that perspective, we move into the third point. But before we go into it, let's further affirm this into our consciousness, that this cause within reflective consciousness is a possibility that we can identify with and utilize as a conceptual model to navigate reality, and affirm what is being experienced in the outer world as contributing to what we desire to create, or our definite chief aim. Charles Haanel says, in the midst of the apparent contradictions, antagonisms, and contrast of your life, there is only one principle at work, only your consciousness operating. So again, in the midst of the apparent contradictions, antagonisms, and contrasts of your life, there is only one principle at work, only your consciousness operating. In other words, looking at reality from the perspective of reality being an externalization of consciousness enables you to keep what we call the power. When we say keep the power, the truth is we always have the power. We just interpret the power from certain perspectives. And we want to interpret the power from the perspective of cause within, to reflect as outer world change, to mirror the consciousness within. He also says, the world without reflects the circumstances and the conditions of the consciousness within. Again, a very powerful affirmation. The world without reflects the circumstance and the conditions of the consciousness within. Now, when we see it from this perspective, we have a greater ability to go into cause within reflective consciousness. In other words, reflection, where we can cross-reference and evolve the meaning of what we interpret the five sensory data is communicating to us. In other words, the person gives you a certain look, you feel insecure, you evolve through subconscious mind work and affirm that that same look is actually empowering and uplifting. Now, this is not something that is an impossible task to do or even a complicated task to do, because at the end of the day, we do this without even consciously being aware of the process. For example, I deal with entrepreneurs, and many entrepreneurs are afraid of doing deals or selling or reaching out to prospects. Through cause and effect reflection, as well as the repetition of performing the task to the best of their ability, they eventually evolve past the identity of I am afraid when it comes to prospecting or selling and move more into I love and enjoy and I'm passionate about prospecting and selling, because they realize that the value is received by them based on their ability to stay congruent on their presentation that they have the value. Thus, giving and receiving is one. Unconditional love. What you put out comes back to you. More accurately, reality is an externalization of your consciousness. If your consciousness states that you are a value provider and you receive in correlation, in fair proportion to the value that you put out, then it will reflect accordingly as the reciprocal of that, the outer world theater that will reflect accordingly. So let's move into number 3 then. Very important. If we understand more so each day that the all is represented in consciousness through its inner world compartment and the outer world reflection, we can then further embrace the cause within reflective consciousness. In other words, reflect back more mindfully on our experiences and evolve the meaning within, the beliefs within, the assumptions within, and observe, it's very important, the changes, both gradual and significant, the externalization of the desire or the pathway of the desire. In other words, every day you realize you're making more progress. The change is in consciousness within. And on the journey, we are actually doing 2 things. Number 1, we are practicing inclusion of certain perspectives within consciousness and exclusion of certain perspectives within consciousness. In other words, what are we saying I am to? And this is where we refer to the law of polarity. And it is stated in the Kybalion that this law of polarity enables the hermeticist to transmute one mental state into another. Now reflect back on the example that I gave earlier. That is the transmutation of a mental state into another by choosing the degree of polarity. Okay, instead of interpreting it to be that the person gave you a look and it disempowers you, you see it as interpretation that it empowers you. They say things belonging to different classes cannot be transmuted into each other, but things of the same class may be changed. That is, may have their polarity changed. So an example thus stated here, love never becomes east or west or red or violet, but it may turn into hate by the consciousness that allows it to go in that direction, to be more specific. And he says, likewise, hate may be transformed into love. By changing this polarity, courage may be transmuted into fear, and the reverse. So again, in entrepreneurship, there are different things that we have to do each day to create success. Or in bringing forth what you desire in any area if you choose, there's different things that you know you have to do to create success, contributing factors. Your courage or fear to do it is based on your perspective. What are the perspectives you are identifying with that you experience as courage or fear? And you can choose because you are the I am before the perspective. So you're not the perspective or the identity, but you are the I am prior to the identity or the self-image. And you can change the identity and the self-image to reflect accordingly. He says, the infinite life flows through you, is you. Its doorways are but the faculties which compromise your consciousness. To keep open these doors is the secret of power. So if we're saying all is mind, and everything is individual expressions of the same mind, then infinite intelligence or infinite life flows through you, and it is only our beliefs and assumptions about ourselves, which is usually based on identity, and remember, we are above identity, we are the I am prior to the identity, that creates what we call blockages from understanding. And the way to do this is to practice the fluidity of mind. Fluidity of mind is cause and effect reflection, as well as realizing that there are infinite variables or infinite perspectives on a scale of polarity. And we choose the degree, and the degree is based on choice. And if we don't choose the degree, then the subconscious programming automatically chooses the degree and creates accordingly. A happy thought cannot exist in an unhappy consciousness. Therefore, the consciousness must change. And as the consciousness changes, all conditions necessary to meet the changed consciousness must gradually change in order to meet the requirements of the new situation. He gives a great exercise, which I believe is going to be really valuable to really affirm what we're talking about here. He says, for your exercise this week, try to bring yourself to a realization of the important fact that harmony and happiness are states of consciousness, and do not depend upon the possession of things that are the effects and come as a consequence of correct mental states. So that if we desire material possession of any kind, our chief concern should be to acquire the mental attitude which will bring about the desired result. This mental attitude is brought about by a realization of our spiritual nature and our unity with the universal mind, which is the substance of all things. This realization will bring about everything which is necessary for our complete enjoyment. This is a scientific or correct thinking. So we're talking about accurate thinking. And if we're looking at reality from the perspective that it is consciousness externalized, then we say thoughts are things that are a reflection of our consciousness, and the correct thinking is based on what facilitates that, as in the interpretation based on cause and effect reflection of whatever shows up, and reassigning the meaning or evolving the meanings, as with my example, to be in harmony with what you desire to create. You don't have to go around changing everything. You change based on the law of polarity within, so that you subconsciously choose that interpretation, and then it moves you forward rather than you interpreting as an obstacle. This is what he means by scientific or correct thinking in the realm of consciousness. When we succeed in bringing about this mental attitude, it is comparatively easy to realize our desire as an already accomplished fact. When we can do this, we shall have found the truth that makes us free from every lack or limitation of any kind. The universal cannot express through you as long as you are busy with your plans and your purposes. Quiet the senses, seek inspiration, focus the mental activity on the within, dwell in the consciousness of your unity with omnipotence, still waters run deep, contemplate the multitudinous opportunities to which you have spiritual access by the omnipresence of power. And the idea of reflection, meditation, and release from the suggestions of the outer world, five sensory data and suggestions that are being perceived, will allow us to go into finding our true higher self and also our true desires and what we want to see brought forth reflected accordingly, because we are now choosing the interpretations from within, seeing reality as consciousness externalized. Again, this is a journey, so realize that each day, by embracing this, you become more and more aware of how your consciousness is creating your reality. And in certain environments or circumstances where you experience challenge, one day it'll be more so of joy, bliss, and ease. So you'll be able to navigate that experience and be able to subconsciously create or have experiences that are in alignment with your flow or your desired state, because you don't have any subconscious perceptions that are automatically identifying with the I am to create less than. So the real secret of power is consciousness of power. So all power exists within you. We realize our power when we see more so each day that reality is consciousness externalized. And the secret really is that power is consciousness of power. When you believe that you have the power within through these various conceptual models and understandings that affirm it to a higher degree, then you find your power. And then you notice that you are being less reactive in what shows up because of your consciousness has been altered and thus you experience reality from that perspective. The universal mind is unconditional, therefore, the more conscious we become of our unity with this mind, the less conscious we shall become of the conditions and limitations. And as we become emancipated or freed from conditions, we come into a realization of the unconditional. We have become free. If you want to copy this mind map, the link is in the description. Thank you very much for watching. I'll talk to you soon. Take care.